Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Today we're going to listen to a recent interview with biblical scholar Dr. Michael S Heiser, another one of Art Bell's previous guests. We discuss the origins of the Bible and examine some of the criticisms or accusations some people have of the text and see if there's any misconceptions. First, let's see what Seth thinks about some of the issues covered. Hi Seth, how's things?
Hey, Scott. Oh, pretty all right here. It's been raining nonstop here, but of course that's good old-fashioned Washington spring. So, just more of the same.
Yeah, fair enough. It's been quite hot here as usual in Thailand, but don't want to make too many people jealous. So I believe you had a chance to listen to the interview with Dr. Michael Heiser. Was there anything that caught your interest?
Quite a bit. By the way, great job with that interview. Just what I'd listened to so far. I thought you did a wonderful job of steering the conversation in a lot of different directions to get the most out of it in as little time as humanly possible without necessarily pushing it too far, too fast, or something like that. And it gave him a chance to expound upon quite a few different ideas that people have been questioning for quite a while. What really stood out to me more than anything was the difference of opinion between him and even many other people that you'd had of Christian scholars or Christian theologians there that you've had on the show about a number of different topics within the Bible, of between literalism and metaphors within the Bible there, which I thought was a very, very, very interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, there was an awful lot to talk about. That's why I split it into two, basically, and you listened to part one. And what other things sort of captured your interest?
Well, the fact that he's actually a doctor in this, I mean, he's stated it took him about 15 years to get his doctorate in this, but at the same time, he actually spent a large portion of his life on this and isn't just some passing sort of fan of many of these different ideas, many of these different texts, because he's not just reading the Bible, though the Bible is his main source of much of his information. He does read many other different dialects, which is very, very important for somebody studying ancient cultures.
Yeah, indeed. And yeah, it's good to speak to someone who's studied something like this in depth, because there's a lot of people who have beliefs about the Bible text, sort of Christians and non-Christians, and it's all passed through word of mouth. But, it's good to talk to someone who really knows what they're talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, just the differences of him learning all this different stuff and actually reading and being accepting of different ancient cultures for what they are there, as opposed to trying to fit it into a biblical paradigm, of actually showing that there are many things that are anti-biblical or unbiblical, rather, that are amalgamated into modern day Christian thought. But in reality, it has nothing to do with the Bible.
Yeah, so hopefully we can discuss some of these issues in another show amongst ourselves, but sadly we don't have too much time to chat about it at the moment. We might as well go straight to the interview, and we'll talk about it in a future episode.
Oh, well, thank you, Scott, and I look forward to it.
Me too. Thanks, Seth. Dr. Michael S Heiser is a biblical scholar from the US. Mike earned an MA and Ph.D. in Hebrew, Bible, and ancient Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mike also has an MA in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania and can translate ancient languages such as Biblical Hebrew, Biblical Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Phoenician, Moabite, and Ugaritic cuneiform. As far as I know, he's still currently the academic editor at Logos Bible Software. People may have come across Mike if you're interested in ancient astronauts topics and through appearances on Coast to Coast and with Art Bell. He's also on other podcasts, and we're lucky enough to be joining that list of other podcasts. Mike, welcome to Truth Sentinel.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It's not often that most people get to talk to a biblical scholar, and that includes Christians. I thought I would take this opportunity to clear up some misconceptions that people may have about the Bible, as well as talking about some of the topics I've heard Michael talk about in the past. I know that some of my questions might relate to Michael's research, but also some might be perhaps more about his personal opinions. First of all, Michael, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your background and interest in biblical studies.
Yeah, I didn't have any sort of religious upbringing when I was younger. I became interested in Christianity when I was a teenager and decided, I wanted to become a Christian. And, really from that point on, I really had a deep interest in the Bible, but before that, I mean, I had a deep interest in anything old and weird. So the Bible's just sort of fit in that drawer. But it became really something that drew me in. It was fascinating. I didn't lose my interest in other ancient things, but this sort of became a focus, and eventually I figured out that, boy, I'd really like to do something related to antiquity and specifically the Bible, for a living if that was possible. But I was really, really kind of ignorant. I remember when I was in high school, that was the first time I found out that people actually paid ministers, paid pastors to do what they did. I would probably shock people to know that. How could you not know that? Well, I didn't. And so when I discovered that, it's like, well, boy, I'd like to be able to support myself, do this for a job. And so I decided I need to go to college. I need to, eventually go on for a doctorate. And, it wasn't a neat process by any means. It was actually, kind of flying by the seat of my pants, most of the time because I didn't have any money. So I'd go to school, sit out a year, go to school, sit out a year. But, it took me 15 years to get through, graduate school. Usually it takes people about half that time. But I eventually made it through, and I decided to go into Old Testament because I liked languages. They were fun. I had a good aptitude for that. And I also thought that was where the strangest stuff was, and the most problems, at least as far as what people were sort of taught about the Bible and about the ancient world. So, Old Testament, ancient Near East became my focus, and I've certainly enjoyed it and haven't regretted that.
Yeah, and that would be probably a good place to start with the Old Testament and actually the beginning, Genesis. Mm-hmm. And most people know the first few words of the Bible, in the beginning.
And even those aren't clear.
Yeah. And it says in the beginning was the Word, and I know you've spoken about this before, but I've always found that sort of strange. Like, what does that mean? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's actually John chapter 1, but it's an echo of certain things in the Old Testament. I mean, in my book, The Unseen Realm, which just came out last September, which in and of itself is a story, the product of about 15 years of, the nice word is research, the negative word would be psychosis on my part. This thing that drove my life for about 15 years. But in that book, I talk about this concept. Genesis 1:1 is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And of course he creates with the spoken word. As you keep reading, and get to verse 3, God said, let there be light, and there was light. But when you go to the New Testament with John, as you quoted, you get this passage about in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And, scholars, some scholars anyway will say, well, obviously John here was borrowing from, Gnostic writer X or, Neoplatonic or Platonic this and that. It's none of that. It comes right out of the Old Testament. There are passages in the Old Testament where God appears visibly in human form and is referred to as the Word of God. In other words, this, God appears as a human being, and that's the way we have a conversation with humans, because humans can parse that experience. And it's also in biblical theology done to protect humans from the sort of the unveiled glory presence of God. But it's an expression that refers to a manifestation of deity, a manifestation of God. And of course, later on in John, in verse 14 of the same chapter, we read, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then it goes into the gospel, the story of Jesus. So Jesus is not only the embodied Word, not only the embodied God, and you get that in the Old Testament, God as man in the Old Testament. But the story of Jesus, the story of the Gospels, is that God became incarnate, which is even sort of upping the ante when it comes to a self-revelation to humans. So the concept is really about an appearance of God in human form, but the language sounds kind of strange to us. But it comes right out of the Old Testament.
And no one's really ever described God, but presumably, according to Genesis, he looks exactly like us. Then, if we were created in his image.
Yeah, I mean, in the Old Testament, and it's mostly the Old Testament because this is where the New Testament draws its ideas and in many cases its language from. God, fundamentally God has a problem. Actually has two problems. One is I am so other that if I came to human beings, and I love human beings, I want to have a relationship with them. That's the whole logic of creating humanity back in the garden story. But if I do that, they'll not be able to understand what they're even experiencing, and they'll die. So I've got two problems here to solve. And so that's why God consistently in the Old Testament is sort of mediated. He picks a form that humans can parse with their five senses, either a voice or something visible. And most of the time when it's visible, not all the time, but sometimes it's fire or something like that. But most of the time, overwhelmingly most of the time, it is as a human being, because again, that's what makes humans comfortable. That's what they can process. They understand that experience. And so that's the mediating form. And you go all the way back to Genesis 18 is the most obvious example, where God and two angels come and they have a conversation and a meal with Abraham. And we find out their identities as we read Genesis 18 and 19. But God is there as a man. It doesn't look any different. Of course, some things happen that make it evident that there's something else going on here. But that's sort of the mediated form of choice, and you can actually find that in the Garden of Eden story, where Adam hears God walking, in the cool of the day. It's anthropomorphic language, and they have a conversation there, but it's actually sprinkled throughout the Old Testament. It's nothing original to the Gospels.
And talking of the Garden of Eden, how much of Genesis would you say is literal? Was there a literal Garden of Eden? I remember listening to another podcast, I think it might have been Hagman and Hagman with Stan Deo, and he was talking about where he believed the Garden of Eden was. Do you believe there was a literal Garden of Eden? And if so, wasn't it supposed to be guarded by a flaming sword?
Yeah, it's actually not an easy question, because it goes beyond a yes and a no. So, was there an Eden? Was there a place known as Eden? Well, I do think that we're given specific geography to it. It was actually sort of a region, and then in that region, Genesis 2 says God planted a garden in the east of Eden. So Eden is actually a region. It's not just this little plot of garden land or something like that. But even if you say yes, well then, okay, how do we? What is it about this place that we, are supposed to, process and understand and embrace as far as the literalism of it or not? So even if you land on yes, this was a place, then there are other questions to answer. I think Eden as a place, what we're really being asked to affirm in the Genesis story is that, God comes to earth. Eden is sacred space. Eden is a place where heaven intersects with earth, where the supernatural intersects with the natural, if you want to use those terms. And it shows us that God wants to dwell among his creatures, the things that he has made and the intelligent individuals he's made. And again, it becomes holy ground, it becomes sacred space. And the notion of God doing that with humanity, and of course we have either a literal or a paradigmatic, and the answer, maybe yes or both. Adam and Eve, a first couple, if we want to say it that way. And again, I don't think that's contrary to evolution, even though many Christians would. But God, has this human pair, we'll say, and wants to start a relationship with them. And so, that his commission to them is, I want you to, make every place in the in the earth, on the world, like this place, spread Eden. And that becomes what's known in theology as the dominion mandate. The cultural mandate is another term you'll hear. And it's based upon, be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. They're also commanded to steward the earth, to take care of it. But then spread, Eden throughout the whole earth. And then, of course, things get messed up. So there are bigger truths than, can I plot Eden with latitude and longitude? There are bigger ideas going on here that transcend mere literalism in the Genesis story. But a lot of Bible readers, sort of get fixated on the literalism question, and this isn't by any means the only passage. They tend to read it, in my judgment. If you're fixed on wooden literalism, you sort of tend to read the content artificially, and you miss what the writer actually wanted you to catch, the bigger ideas that he wanted to convey through the process of how he's telling the story. So that you don't have to deny one or the other, but to get stuck on one or the other and limit your vision to either literalism or total, anti-literalism or mythology, sort of really misses the point. There's a lot here that transcends either landing place.
Do we know who wrote Genesis? And was the story dictated by God to the author of Genesis?
No, I think dictation, and pure dictation view of inspiration, how we get the Bible is really rare nowadays. It's nonsense, but I think even lesser versions of it, people try to come up with what I refer to as X-Files, an X-Files view of inspiration, or a paranormal view of inspiration, where the writers, are sort of petrified or paralyzed. Their minds go blank. Their arms and fingers start waving and moving, and poof, they pop out of the trance and they look down at the table and think, wow, that's kind of neat. Boy, did I write that? I can't wait to read it. These are phony. They're artificial views of what's going on. I mean, any biblical book, and I'll come back to your question about Genesis in a moment, but any biblical book, guess what? The biblical teaching about how these sacred books originated is that God used people. Like, wow, isn't that profound? Well, on one level, it's not. On another level, it is, because what inspiration really says, what it's really describing, is God's providential role in the lives of people who are prepared, again, through a whole range of experiences, that God is the unseen hand behind those experiences, preparing them through training, through tragedy, through success, through all sorts of things for this moment that he would prompt them to write something down for posterity. It's a very normal human process, except that, again, in biblical theology, God is behind these events to put that writer in the right time and place and occasion. So, humanly speaking, Genesis is attributed to Moses. I don't think that Moses wrote, Genesis 1 to 11, for example. I don't think that comes from the hand of Moses. I'm not what's called in biblical scholarship that the standard view is a documentarian, JEDP theory, that the Torah is the result of a bunch of, a patchwork quilt weaving of, 4, 5, 6 different sources. I don't believe that, because the reasoning behind it is often circular. I'm what used to be called, I guess, in the 19th century, a supplementarian, and that is, I don't see there's any reason why Moses couldn't be a real person and could not have written down a lot of what we have in Torah, as told to him by his own ancestors, and he writes it down. He codifies the stories that were passed on through oral tradition, and composes things himself. But there are things that are quite evident in Genesis that he didn't write. But I'm not bothered by that. People take the law of Moses phrase, Torah Moshe, and they say, well, you have to believe that Moses wrote every word, or else this is a horrible heresy. Well, that's absurd, because in Hebrew it's just a construct phrase. It just means, it could mean many things. It could mean the law produced by Moses. It could mean the law about Moses. It could be the law associated with Moses. In Hebrew grammar, these kinds of phrases have a wide semantic range. But people don't really stop to think about it, because they're usually reacting to something. And, higher criticism has taken the idea of any Mosaic authorship, even the existence of Moses, and just poo-pooed it. And so you have people who have a high view of the Bible and they want to react against it, and they go 180 degrees when they really don't have to. So, yeah, I mean, sure, he could have written part of Moses or part of Genesis. Maybe he didn't write any of it. I think he did. But on one level, I don't really care. Most of the authors of the biblical books, for instance, are not even named, so they're anonymous. I'd say easily half of the Bible, the books of the Bible, are anonymous. The writers don't give us their names.
And I know you've looked into the grammar of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, looked into is probably not the word. You're very knowledgeable about the grammar. And
I've had it beaten into my head, more like.
I wondered if you could explain a little bit about the us that are mentioned in Genesis. Let us create them in our image. And I had a look on your site, and I think I might be right in saying that you wouldn't describe angels as being that they could be described as aliens. But I just wondered why, if you could go into who the us are and why they couldn't be described as aliens.
Yeah, the plurality in Genesis 1:26, let us create humankind in our image, and then in verse 27 it switches back to singular. So God created humankind in His image. Okay, and I talk about this in my book, The Unseen Realm, about why there's plurality and why there's a switch to singular, why there's this interplay. There's plurality there because initially God is speaking to, he has an audience, he's speaking to a group, and you say, well, who's the group? A lot of Christians would say that's the Trinity. Again, I don't believe that at all. I mean, I am a Trinitarian theologically, but the Trinity is not in Genesis 1:26. Who's there is the members of the heavenly host, again, what scholars call the divine council, which is a term taken from Psalm 82, verse 1. God is speaking to the sons of God who are there, according to Job 38, verse 7, who were there before the foundation of the world, before humanity is created. And God is announcing something. Hey, let's do this. And it's not the Trinity because, standard Trinitarianism would have the other members of the Trinity co-eternal with God. So why would God need to make an announcement of something they should already know? It doesn't make any sense. So that's not what's going on here. But God says, look, let's do this. And the plurality links God, them, his audience, and humanity in some way. Because they're all connected by the language. But when the creation actually happens, there's only singular. The grammar is always and only singular. God is the lone creator, and humans are actually created to be his imagers. Well, then why the plurality? It's because the idea of imaging, which is kind of a long one, we'll skip for this point unless you want to go into it a bit later, or people can read it in the book for that matter. But the idea of imaging is representation. So humanity, by definition, is the image of God. We are God's representations and his representatives, his agents, as it were, on earth in this terrestrial plane. And the plurality shows us that the same idea is true of non-human entities, the divine sons of God, the heavenly entourage. If you want to call them angels, fine, even though that's technically imprecise. But they also image God. They also represent God in the spiritual world. And they are like us in this relationship. And so that's why we have plurality. But when it comes down to creative power and creative authority, then the grammar is always singular. And to the alien, question, if when people ask that, one of the first things I want to know is, well, how are you defining an alien? And typically it's the extraterrestrial, it's the space alien. Okay, well, space aliens, again, if they're the product of evolution, if they're out there, I mean, I'm not offended if there are aliens. I think it'd be kind of cool personally, but I don't find it a theologically offensive idea. But if they're out there, they're bound by the laws of physics. They have to, have some form of nutrition, probably hydration. If they're carbon-based life forms anyway, they have to reproduce their species to live. They need craft to fly around or whatever. This is not the way you see angels described, not only in the Bible, but other texts as well. One of the curious omissions in ancient astronaut theory that nobody likes to talk about, if at least if they buy that idea, is that there are no texts in any ancient culture that have the gods coming from one planet to this one. There are scenes of the gods flying around, and so that's extrapolated into, spaceships and whatnot. The best example you get are the Vimanas, which are like flying houses, but they're not aerodynamic or anything like that. But that's the best you get. But even they are not interplanetary, and that's a huge omission for ancient alien theory. And again, it's illustrative of this disconnect between how angels, spiritual beings, are presented as opposed to the idea of an alien, which would not be a spiritual being. It would be a very physical being by nature that needs to do all these other things, like, reproduce and eat and drink and all that stuff.
Couldn't they?
So
couldn't they be
they're,
both?
they're
Because you mentioned the angel that had a meal earlier.
Mhm.
So in that
Yeah,
form, yeah.
you could argue that maybe we have an interdimensional being. Okay, this is where the next thing goes. Again, there's two facets to that. Okay, does the interdimensional being, is it a spiritual being or is it a physical being from a different dimension? I mean, if we traveled from one dimension to another, we wouldn't, we'd still be physical beings by nature. Well, if it's a physical being, then that's a disconnect, with the angelic idea. If it's a spirit being that then takes form or appears, visually as embodied, well, then you have a connection with the angel idea, at least the way the angels are presented in the Bible and other ancient texts. So it's actually not a simple question. People tend to assume that there's this simple equation, those silly Bible readers, they don't realize what they're dealing with aliens here. Well, silly ancient astronaut theorist, you haven't asked about 4 or 5 questions that need to be asked and answered. And the problem on that end, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to snipe here, it's just a real problem, is that we're not given the answers to a lot of these questions. But if you're going to strike the equation, you kind of need these questions to be asked and answered to talk coherently about what it is you are embracing, what the idea is you're embracing. So I see a lot of disconnects, again, but depending on how the question is framed, at some point you can start talking about possible overlaps. But they're all speculations. My major objection to ancient astronaut theory is people that use ancient texts and they import these ideas into the text when the texts don't actually say them. That's cheating at best. At worst, it's manipulative. It's not telling people really the truth about what they're reading and the limitations of what they're reading. So that's kind of my big gripe with the whole thing. There's ancient alien theory has everywhere, and all of its proponents have a disturbing propensity to fabricate information and fill in gaps, and then not tell people that's what they're doing.
Whilst we're sticking with Genesis and the origins of mankind, Adam and Eve, one of my friends always asks me, wouldn't the offspring of Adam and Eve have had to commit incest? And so that was just one of the questions I wanted to clear up. Would you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you believe in monogenism, which is a 19th century, well, actually even earlier term, one original pair, then yeah, you have to have interbreeding on that level. Scientifically, people can legitimately talk about, well, the reason it's a problem now is because we've had, so many environmental effects and we've had so many opportunities for genetic mutation. And if you get a mutation and you have interbreeding, then the mutation is perpetuated or made worse or something like that, again, in layman's terms. And all of that's true. If we're taking the story at face value, back in Edenic days, that wouldn't have been true. So it's not a problem. There is no moral law, against it, in the biblical story originally. Later on in history, there is, and there are different reasons for that. The laws in Leviticus, for example, they're not doing genetics, they're not doing science, even though they could figure that out. But the laws about incest are at least defining the inner family, as opposed to the extended family, and drawing sexual lines between the two. They're really different reasons for that. But we don't have any of that going, in the initial human story. And so, the people biblical writers and whatnot would have framed it that way. This is, again, the origin of the population. We don't have this other baggage, either in terms of a natural result or some of these other reasons to observe these boundaries. We don't have these problems here, so who cares? Now, if you believe in, and there are plenty of people who did and who still do, believe that there are cryptic references possibly, and that's an important word because by definition a cryptic reference isn't a clear one. there could be indications of co-Adamism. In other words, you don't have a single origin point, single couple for humanity. You have more than one couple. For instance, where did Cain get his wife? And I think even the better example is when Cain is expelled from his, by his parents. He goes off and gets married, but he builds a city. Okay, well, he didn't do that by himself. It reads like there are other population groups. So if you're a monogenist, you say things like, and this is true, we're not given a chronology in Genesis. We don't know how many years, we don't know how old, Cain was. We don't know how many years it was between this and that. And you could have lots of other kids multiplying. It could be centuries. And so that would make sense in a monogenistic framework. But the other side would say, well, you obviously have humanity started in different places, and that's who Cain's marrying and working with. God just happened to select this one couple to focus on. And it's also true that Adam and Eve are paradigmatic, especially Adam, to Israel. In other words, a lot of things that are said about Adam and that happened to Adam mirror things in the history of Israel. And so people would say, well, that's deliberate. That's how we need to look at Adam. Adam is selected from other humans, just as Israel was selected from other nations, and their stories parallel each other. Both of those things you can defend from the text. And again, but by nature, a cryptic reference, isn't clear. But you have people on both sides of that issue.
Yeah, I can see that. Like other couples might not have been mentioned. Another thing that many non-believers would say about the Bible, talking about things that aren't mentioned, would be things like dinosaurs. Do you think dinosaurs are mentioned in any way at all in the Bible?
I don't. I think references to Leviathan and Behemoth, Bahamut in Hebrew, are not giving us descriptions, eyewitness testimony to literal dinosaurs and, ichthyosaurs or something, sea serpents or sea monsters. And the reason is because these things pop up, especially Leviathan, explicitly in Canaanite texts, outside the Bible, where they are very clearly mythological, or mythopoetic is the academic term. And that is Leviathan, also in Canaanite it's Leviathan or Lotan, is a well-known, fairly ubiquitous symbol of chaos. In other words, the forces of chaos and disorder that God, or in the case of Canaanite religion, the gods, have to subdue and tame for humans to be able to function. And so these things are often brought into the Bible. Psalm 74 is a good example where God, the creation language, the language of Genesis 1 is used in Psalm 74, and then Leviathan is thrown into the mix, where God slays, Leviathan, he slays the sea beast, and then he brings about, either creation order. And it's also applied to the Exodus, that the sea becomes dry land and people pass through it. So the idea is that in the beginning, God made the earth habitable. He tamed the forces of chaos, and at the Exodus, he defeats the gods of Egypt. He tames the waters here of the Red Sea and saves his people. Again, there are ideas here that to the ancient, and this is the key thought, to the ancient person, not to the modern person who wants to cheat because of science, okay? To the ancient person, the meaning of these passages transcended literalism. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't see these terms and these motifs for what they were to the ancient mind, we're going to miss a lot of the things that the writer wanted to telegraph for us. Again, the bigger ideas of Scripture. But it's just unfortunate. We have a lot of people who love the Bible, have a high view of it, but they are so transfixed on this wooden literalistic approach that they actually miss a good deal of what's being taught in the text and what was intended to be taught by the writer.
Does that mean the parting of the Red Sea didn't happen, or when we don't know whether it happened?
Oh, I think parting of the Red Sea is a historical event. I don't think, we're so used to thinking of Charlton Heston when it comes to that, but I think actually later adaptations are better. There's the one with Ben Kingsley in it that I think is really the closest to the text that you get. I don't know if your listeners may have seen that. I don't know if it's shown in the UK or not, but Ben Kingsley is Moses in one of these, and it's very close to the text. God tells him to go out there, hold your staff over the water, and over the text actually says the wind blew all night, and the result was that the waters were parted, and it made a dry path for the people to cross. Again, it's still a miracle, and I'm not offended intellectually by miracles. God can intervene a lot of these things just extend from the question of is there a God or not, which proposition makes more sense. And then if you land on the theistic side, then you have really simple questions. Well, can this God act? Can he speak? Can he do anything? That sort of thing. And so since I accept that, I don't have a problem with a miraculous event. But, does that mean that, it's sort of described or happened in the way that, Hollywood has given to us? Well, probably not. But I think you still have a divine intervention, to rescue the Israelites from Egypt, and that, you had to have a pretty astounding thing, miraculous thing happen for that to work. And I don't have any problem with that, but I tend not to Hollywoodize it in my head.
And moving on to another slightly different topic, the Tower of Babel. I know you're a linguist, so that's where all the languages were mixed up, and I wondered if you had come across any evidence that the Tower of Babel existed and that modern languages can be linked to one particular place.
Yeah, I think this is a good example where there's an overclaim by biblical interpreters based upon what the text says. The easy part of this is the tower itself. Yeah, archaeologists have found a ziggurat at Babel, and they typically attribute this particular structure to the story. Again, that's kind of the easy part. But there's a lot about the story that people don't know, that they're not taught in church or they're not taught in Sunday school. And that is, we know this thing about the text actually says God confused the languages, and scattered the peoples. Again, that is transparent. That's what people tend to hear in church, and all that sort of thing. So, the people that were there, that were present at the time, they get their languages confused as part of this scattering. Okay, it never says, and it can't because of Genesis 10, that all the languages of all the peoples on earth that we know today are involved in this event. Because in Genesis 10, we get a listing of the nations that the biblical writers knew about. Okay, it doesn't include India and China, North America, South America, Central America, Australia. It doesn't include any of that. So people tend to sort of, again, overclaim things for what the text actually says because they don't observe the context. But anyway, Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 is actually a key element to understanding what's going on at Babel. And this is the part that you never hear about in church, you never hear about in Sunday school, and frankly, it's because most pastors and ministers and whatnot don't even know that it's here. And that is, here the verses say this: when the Most High, again, it's not hard to figure out who that is. Okay, that's God. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, okay, there's reference back to the division of the nations at Babel. When he did all that, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion, Yahweh's portion, is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Now, this passage, many of your listeners, if they pick up a Bible at this point and say, well, I never heard of that before, they might read in verse 8 a different phrase, that God fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. And that is what most English translations say. It's not the correct reading. Sons of God is the correct reading. That is the reading that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But you don't even need textual criticism to figure this out. It wouldn't make any sense for God to scatter the nations at Babel, to divide them according to the number of the sons of Israel, for a very transparent reason. Israel didn't exist at the time. Israel is not listed in the table of nations in Genesis 10. It's only after Babel that God calls Abraham and begins the story of Israel. So you have a clear example here where someone, a scribe at some point, fiddled with the text, took out sons of God, also took out the reference to the gods in verse 43 of the same chapter, and made substitutions. We can talk about that. There are a small number of instances like this that scholars are very well aware of, and we get material like Dead Sea Scroll stuff that tell us, okay, here's the oldest text we have. This is what it said. It makes more sense. But what you have going on in Deuteronomy 32:8-9, the biblical story is that here we are after the flood. God repeats the Adamic, mandate to Noah and his sons, be fruitful, multiply, spread over the earth, make it like Eden. We're going to try this over again. And they don't do it. They congregate at Babel. They build a tower to make a name for themselves. Well, if you know what a ziggurat is part of a temple complex in Mesopotamia, and that's where we're in Babel here. This is the context for it. And you built one of those to localize the deity so that the deity would come down and reside with you. So we could look at that and say, oh, isn't that nice? They want God to live with them. Well, that's actually completely contrary to what God told them to do. And so God is offended at that. It's like, look, we just got out on the other side of the flood here, and you're still not wanting me as your God. You're still not listening. I created you. I want a relationship, yes, but here's what I'm asking you to do. You don't want it, fine. I'm going to allot you now. I'm going to put you under the authority of some of the members of my heavenly host, some of my entourage, some of the sons of God. And you can have them as your gods, or they're going to rule you, and I'm done with you. I'm disinheriting you. I'm divorcing you. And now I'm going to go pick one guy out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and I'm going to raise up a new people to myself. And that people is my inheritance. That people is going to be Israel. Again, that's the biblical story. But, God, even when God does that, when he makes a covenant with Abraham, he says that it's through you that all of those other nations will be blessed. So God doesn't completely disinherit them. He still wants them to come back. There's still this, again, he loves the nations too, but he's punishing them. And that's the part of the story that you never hear when it comes to Babel, this whole idea. But it frames the entirety of the rest of the Old Testament, and even on into the New Testament, because the rest of the story is Yahweh against these other gods, because these other gods, the sons of God, become corrupt. Psalm 82, we're told that point blank. They become corrupt in the way they relate to people. They seduce the Israelites into worshiping them instead of directing them to Yahweh. So we have this tension, this conflict between God and the other gods, and we have conflict between Israel and all the other nations. And that's the whole Old Testament. It's the whole story, and it bleeds into the New in various ways that we can talk about or not. But it's an important story. But it tends to, again, here we are back to this focused literalism. Like we have to account for the Cherokee language in Babel as a linguist. No, we don't. Okay, it's not even in view. It's a very regionally isolated group of civilizations, group of cultures. You can try to derive back to one proto-language from that. If you exclude the other ones, you can make a case for that. But that isn't the point. It's just not the point. We're so fixated on we've got to take this question that a modern linguist has and find it somewhere in the Bible and read it literalistically, and we miss the bigger story. But this is constantly what happens with people who even have a high view of the Bible. They are trained to read it simplistically and to make it some sort of vanguard or buffer between them and the world of science, or them and the world of linguistics, or something like that. It's just a shame. Just to be honest with you, it's just a shame, because you miss the bigger picture constantly when you're doing stuff like this.
So from what I understand, you're saying that the Tower of Babel incident may be more of a localized regional event, and would you have said that about the flood of Noah as well?
Yeah, I think you get the same thing when you do get to the flood, because if you asked, if you walked up to Noah and said, "Hey Noah, can you give me a list of all the nations in the world? What's the world composed of? What is all the earth to you?" He'd give you the list in Genesis 10 and say, "Didn't you memorize this in school?" This is their world. So yeah, if the flood is a regional event that affects all of these nations that are listed in this, well, to them it's a worldwide event. But again, God knows better. We know better, because the world is bigger than that. So again, we tend to take the story and we take the language of the story and we overclaim from it. In fact, if you go to the flood account and you pick out all the phrases that are used for a global event, phrases like all the earth, was covered with water, or all flesh died, all plus whatever noun in it, you can actually find the exact same phrase elsewhere in the Old Testament where the context tells you very clearly that the term does not refer to totality or to an exhaustive, it doesn't have an exhaustive sense. For instance, there are passages where something happens and all the people of the earth fled into the forest. Really? Really? Like, how long did it take the guy in Australia? Did he rent a canoe or something? And, it's absurd. It's just an over-literalizing of the language. What matters in biblical interpretation is context. Context is king. And the context of all these things, it's given to us. Right there in Genesis 10, that's the world they know. It's the world of the Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean and what we call the Middle East. That's the world to them. So that needs to impact how we view the flood event. That needs to impact how we view the Babel event. Otherwise we're taking a text produced by a writer, again, providentially put in that situation and influenced and prepared by God, again, inspiration. We're taking all of that and saying, well, none of that matters. I'm going to take this passage and I'm going to make it address this modern thing that I'm wondering about. That's called interpreting out of context, not in it. And so context is king, but we usually don't do that. And people who don't do it, I'm not saying they're sinister. I mean, they might be motivated in a very good way. I need to refute or think about evolution or Darwinism or whatever it is, and I need to find this in the Bible somewhere. I need to make the Bible speak to it. Well, they don't realize that they're making the Bible, they're turning the Bible into something it was never intended to be. I mean, I get into conversations like with atheists or whatever, and this, they always criticize the Bible for like science stuff in it that's not modern science. Well, like, no kidding. Why are you mad at a book for not being what it was never intended to be? Are you mad at your daughter for not being your son? Are you mad at your dog for not being your cat? Why would you take a thing and express vitriol toward it for not being what it was never intended to be? And so what I usually ask them is, look, if you can explain how your approach is at all coherent and rational, then we can have a discussion. But until you do, it sounds kind of dumb. Okay, it sounds self-serving at best, and at worst it sounds kind of dumb. Because you don't really do this with other things, but so why are you committing this act of irrationality here? And of course the reason is because, I hate to say it, but lots of Christians and people who love the Bible, that's where they put the debate. Because of their over-literalizing of the text in many cases. And it's just, again, I think you can tell it. It's a frustration point with me that even operating out of good motives, we make the Bible into something it was never intended to be, and then we expect it to dance to our tune. And it just doesn't produce good results. Just across the board, it doesn't produce good results.
Yeah, I sort of understand that. So if the flood was localized, what about the animals then? I've got a particular interest in Noah's Ark, because when I was younger I climbed Ararat looking for it, but I didn't find it. But it's permanently covered in ice at the top of it, and some people believe that there is still something underneath the ice there.
There may be. I don't think a local event rules out an ark or saving the animals. I don't think it rules out any of that. Look, if you have a flood that covers hundreds of thousands of square miles, that's big. Okay, I mean that is no trivial event. It would be shocking. It would be, again, shocking to the point of being etched in the memory of every person who heard about it or witnessed it, or the tradition of it was passed down. I mean, it's not something that you can turn into something that we experience today. We don't experience anything like that today, anything of that kind of scale. So I don't know why. Well, I guess I do know why. A lot of people are offended by the idea of a regional or local flood, again, because that's not how they're taught to think about it. But again, I would challenge people, and I know if you don't have Bible software, it's probably like an insurmountable task, or it's going to be far too much work. But look up all the instances of kol basar, all flesh, whether it's human or animal. Kol haaretz, all the earth. I mean, just look them up. You will find instances where the identical phrases occur, where the context, tells us it can't mean totality. And so the interpretive question, the hermeneutical question becomes, well, if the phrase itself doesn't have to speak of totality, could we possibly read non-totality back into the flood account? Well, we have to if we're taking Genesis 10 as being our definition of all the world. But let's say that, to them it was all the world, it can still, be read back into and produce a regional event. What I'm saying is that the local regional reading can be quite biblical, can be quite textually defensible. It just depends, again, on how you approach the question and what you do with the textual data at your disposal.
So would you be saying also that it doesn't necessarily mean all the species of the world? It just means when it comes to animals, but it means all the animals in that particular region?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you're reading a local regional event, the quote all language would be localized to that region, and within that region it would be exhaustive. That's why you would need an ark. You want animal life, human life to survive. But it would nevertheless, again, be read through that filter. And again, all I'm saying, I'm not telling people they have to, take this or that view. All I'm saying is that you have to realize that people who can defend a local regional flood event with the biblical text, they don't have to appeal to geology to do this. And this is not a new thing. I mean, people have been aware of the text for millennia. I mean, it just is what it is, and it can be read that way, even though your tradition probably never introduced you, to such a reading. But the text can be read that way fairly easily.
And when it comes to the origin of Christianity itself, I know that many people say that. Especially in the last sort of decade or two, people have been saying that Christianity is just the same stories borrowed from earlier religions, including the flood account, Gilgamesh. What would you say to that?
I would say they need to read the New Testament. I mean that claims like that are offered by people who have refused to invest the time into reading the material. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. What possible relationship would the story of Jesus have to Gilgamesh? I mean, it's just absurd. Now, if you want to talk about the Old Testament, the problem, the key word there is borrowing. All right, when a scholar uses the word borrowing, like this let's just take the flood story. Okay, the flood story here in the Bible, or the creation story, or XYZ, story. When a scholar says borrowed from like Mesopotamian material, what they typically mean is that they can trace a word or a phrase or the structure of a passage to another text, to a text that's external to the Bible. For instance, this is probably a better example, even though it's a little more esoteric. The way Genesis 1 begins, it begins with Bereshit, which is a preposition plus, noun, and then you have a clause and so on and so forth. And you keep going, through the clause types and the clause structures of the first three verses. Well, those mimic the first few lines of Enuma Elish, syntactically, grammatically. The content is different, but the structure is the same. And so scholars have looked at that and thought, okay, this is a good clue that Genesis is going to be written as some sort of response, some sort of polemic, some sort of poke in the eye, theologically, religiously, to this text, because it's mimicking part of it. Now that kind of thing, there's a close interaction between two texts, Bible and non-Bible, that kind of thing. But a lot of the stuff conceptually, okay, beliefs about the afterlife or beliefs about a local or a flood event just generally, this kind of thing you don't need actual borrowing for. What you have is you have a common culture, because all of these nations, these other texts, Egyptian, Akkadian, Sumerian, they all come from the same general geographic region. And so there's going to be a cross-fertilization of ideas just because of proximity. So you don't actually have literary borrowing, but you do have a common experience, you have a common culture, you have a common set of ideas. Now, that's why there's a lot of sameness between the Bible and some of these other texts. But the problem is that people stop there. They'll mislabel something as borrowing, but then they stop there and they don't ask, well, what's different? What are the differences between the two? And theologically, there are significant differences between the Old or New Testament especially and something in the ancient Near East. Yeah, there's a lot of sameness, even religiously, culturally, in terms of worldview. There's a lot of that. Again, it doesn't have to be direct borrowing. There's a lot of that, but there are also really, really crucial differences.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Part 2 next week. Goodbye.